A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Herman, I was looking at a satellite map of the region this morning, zooming in on the southern border of Israel and the Sinai Peninsula. If you look at the line that runs from the Mediterranean down to Eilat on the Red Sea, it is remarkably straight for almost the entire length. It looks like someone took a ruler and drew a diagonal line across the desert. But then, right at the very top, as you get close to the sea, there is this sudden jagged protrusion that sticks out into the Negev. It breaks the symmetry of the whole map. It looks like a glitch in the geography, or like the person drawing the line suddenly had their hand bumped.
Herman Poppleberry here. Corn, you have hit on a remarkable cartographic accident of the 20th century. That protrusion is the Gaza Strip. If you ask most people today, in March of 2026, why it has that specific shape, or why it even exists as a distinct geographic entity, they might give a vague answer about ancient history or biblical borders. But the reality is far more technical. Our housemate Daniel sent us a prompt about this, wanting us to dig into the engineering of these borders and the history of Gaza as a crossroads. He wanted to know how a temporary military line from 77 years ago became one of the most rigid borders on the planet.
It is strange to call it an accident, because when you see it on a map it looks so deliberate. It is a neat little rectangle, roughly 41 kilometers long and between 6 and 12 kilometers wide. But once you peel back the layers of how those lines were drawn, you realize it was less about long-term planning and more about where the tanks happened to be sitting on a specific Tuesday in 1949. The modern Gaza Strip is really a product of military lines being frozen in time, rather than any natural geographic feature.
To understand the Strip as we know it today, you have to go back to the end of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Before that war, there was no such thing as the Gaza Strip. There was the city of Gaza, which has been there for thousands of years, and the surrounding Gaza district, but the specific rectangle we see today did not exist as a political unit. It was just a coastal portion of the British Mandate of Palestine.
That goes back to the 1922 British Mandate border, the straight line from the 1906 agreement between the British and the Ottomans.
That is the one. That 1906 line was a classic piece of colonial cartography. It was intended to separate the British-controlled Sinai in Egypt from the Ottoman-controlled territory in Palestine. It was a survey line drawn from Rafah on the Mediterranean coast down to Taba on the Gulf of Aqaba. They drew it through the desert because there were no major population centers there at the time. It was a clean, administrative boundary designed to keep two empires from bumping into each other. But when the 1948 war broke out, that straight line was ignored by the military forces on the ground. The Egyptian army moved north into what was then mandatory Palestine. They pushed up the coast, through Gaza, and got as far as Ashdod, which is only about 35 kilometers south of Tel Aviv.
And that is where the military shift happens. As the war progressed, the newly formed Israeli forces launched counteroffensives, specifically Operation Yoav in October of 1948 and Operation Horev in December. They pushed the Egyptian forces back toward the old 1906 border. By the time the final ceasefire was being negotiated in early 1949, the Egyptian army had been pushed out of most of the Negev desert, but they still held this small coastal pocket around the city of Gaza. They were essentially backed up against the sea and the old international border.
This is where Ralph Budge enters the story. He was the United Nations mediator who brokered the 1949 armistice agreements on the island of Rhodes. Bunch was a brilliant diplomat, and he eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize for this work. But his job was not to create a permanent country or a permanent border. His job was simply to get the shooting to stop. He was dealing with a modus vivendi, a way of living together until a real solution could be found.
That is a crucial legal distinction. The line drawn in 1949, the one that created the Gaza Strip, was officially called the Armistice Demarcation Line. It was never intended to be an international border. If you look at the maps from that era, the line is often drawn in green ink, which is why people started calling it the Green Line.
In fact, the text of the 1949 Egyptian-Israeli Armistice Agreement itself is explicit. Article 5, paragraph 2 says that the line is not to be construed in any sense as a political or territorial boundary. It was a military line of contact. It basically said, the Israeli army is here, the Egyptian army is there, and this is where we will stop fighting for now. But because a final peace treaty was never signed between the parties in the years that followed, that temporary ceasefire line became frozen. It became the de facto border that defined the territory for the next several decades.
It is striking because it means the Gaza Strip is essentially a military footprint. The reason the border turns inland at a certain point and then runs parallel to the coast is simply because that is where the front lines were when the clock ran out on the negotiations. If the Israeli counteroffensive had lasted another week, or if the Egyptian defense had been slightly stronger or weaker in a specific sector, the strip would have a completely different shape today. It is a geometric representation of a military stalemate.
You can see the human cost of this accidental geography in the way the line interacts with the local landscape. The 1949 line actually cut off several Arab villages from their agricultural lands. There are stories of farmers who woke up to find that their houses were on the Egyptian side of the line, but their wells and their olive groves were now on the Israeli side. It was not drawn based on who lived where, it was drawn based on where the machine gun nests were located. This created immediate humanitarian headaches. The Egyptians suddenly found themselves administering this tiny, overcrowded sliver of land packed with hundreds of thousands of refugees who had fled from other parts of the region during the war.
And unlike the West Bank, the Egyptians did not even want to annex this territory.
Correct. Unlike Jordan, which annexed the West Bank after the war, Egypt kept Gaza under a separate military administration. They set up something called the All-Palestine Government in September of 1948, led by Haj Amin al-Husseini. It was a puppet administration intended to provide a Palestinian alternative to Jordanian influence, but it never really had any sovereign power. By 1959, Egypt officially dissolved that government and just ran the Strip as occupied territory. They never offered Egyptian citizenship to the people living there. They kept it in a state of legal limbo. So, for those 19 years, you have this accidental geography being managed by a temporary military administration that had no long-term plan for the territory.
It is a classic example of how temporary solutions in geopolitics often become permanent problems. If you do not resolve the underlying political issues when the lines are drawn, those lines eventually take on a life of their own. We talked about a similar phenomenon in episode 544 when we looked at the engineering sovereignty puzzles in other parts of the world. Once a line is on a map for 20 years, it becomes a psychological reality, even if it started as a total accident.
Then everything changed again in 1967 during the Six-Day War. Israel captured the Strip from Egypt in a matter of days, but even then the old armistice line remained the administrative boundary. Israel did not just erase the line and merge Gaza into the rest of the country, they kept it as a distinct unit. So the accidental shape from 1949 was preserved, even though the military reason for its existence, the presence of the Egyptian army, was gone.
It is as if the ghost of a dead army is still defining the map today. But I want to pivot for a second, Herman. While the Strip as a geopolitical entity is a modern invention, the city of Gaza and the surrounding area have a history that goes back thousands of years. It was not always this closed-off, isolated sliver. For most of human history, it was the opposite. It was one of the most important open crossroads in the ancient world.
That is a vital point. If you look at the long arc of history, the modern situation is the anomaly. For 3,000 years, Gaza was known as the gateway to the Levant. It was the place where Africa met Asia. If you were traveling from Egypt to Mesopotamia, or from Arabia to the Mediterranean, you almost certainly had to pass through Gaza. It was the only place where you could reliably find water and supplies after crossing the harsh Sinai Desert.
I love that title it had in the Hellenistic era, the Athens of Asia. That really tells you something about its cultural status. It was not just a military outpost, it was a center of learning, trade, and philosophy. It was a place where Greek, Egyptian, and Semitic cultures all mashed together.
It really was. And the reason for that was its location at the terminus of two of the most important trade routes in history. First, you have the Via Maris, or the Way of the Sea. This was the ancient highway that connected Egypt with the empires of the north, the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. Gaza was the first major city you hit after crossing the Sinai. It was the port of entry for the entire region.
And then you have the incense route, which is even more compelling to me. This was the route that brought frankincense and myrrh from the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula all the way up through the Nabatean kingdom in Petra and across the Negev desert. And where did that route end? It ended at the port of Gaza.
Gaza was the logistics hub of the ancient world for luxury goods. All that incense, which was worth its weight in gold in the Roman and Greek worlds because it was essential for religious rituals and medicine, was shipped out of the harbor at Gaza. This made the city incredibly wealthy and strategic. Every empire wanted to control it because if you controlled Gaza, you controlled the flow of global trade.
You can see that in the list of people who conquered it. It is a who is who of world history. You have the Egyptian pharaohs, like Thutmose III, who used it as his administrative headquarters in the 15th century before the Common Era. Then you have the Philistines, who made it one of their 5 great city-states.
We should clarify for the listeners, the ancient Philistines were not the same people as the modern Palestinians. The Philistines were likely an Aegean or sea people population that arrived from the area of modern-day Greece or Crete around the 12th century before the Common Era. They were eventually assimilated or disappeared as a distinct group after the Babylonian conquests. The name Palestine was later applied to the whole region by the Romans as a way to erase the Jewish connection to the land after the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century, but the actual Philistine culture had been gone for centuries by then.
That is an important distinction. But even after the Philistines, the history continues. Alexander the Great faced one of his toughest sieges at Gaza in 332 before the Common Era. The city was so well fortified and the people were so determined that it took Alexander 2 months to break through. He was actually wounded in the shoulder by a catapult bolt there. He was so angry at the city's resistance that he eventually dragged the city's governor, a man named Batis, behind his chariot while he was still alive. That shows you how formidable the city's status was. It was the only thing standing between Alexander and the conquest of Egypt.
After Alexander, you have the Romans, who rebuilt the city and turned it into a major center of Hellenistic culture. Then the Byzantines, and then the early Islamic conquests in the 7th century. Gaza actually has a very special place in Islamic history because it is said to be the burial place of Hashim ibn Abd Manaf, who was the great-grandfather of the Prophet Muhammad. That is why the city is sometimes called Gaza of Hashim.
It is incredible how many times this place has changed hands. I think I read it has been conquered or changed administration over 20 times in recorded history. You have the Crusaders, who built a massive fortress there in the 12th century, and then Saladin, who took it back. Then the Mamluks, who were these incredible builders and soldiers from Egypt. They really transformed the city into a major provincial capital.
The Mamluk era is when you see a lot of the architecture that survived into the modern era, like the Great Mosque of Gaza, also known as the Al-Omari Mosque. That building is a perfect architectural metaphor for the city's history. It started as a Philistine temple, then became a Byzantine church, then a mosque, then a Crusader cathedral, and then a mosque again. It is layers upon layers of different civilizations built on top of each other.
Then you have the 400 years of Ottoman rule, which started in 1516. This is a period that often gets overlooked, but it was really important for Gaza's development, especially the Ridwan dynasty in the 16th and 17th centuries. They were local governors who ran Gaza almost like a private kingdom. They invested heavily in the city, building baths, markets, and palaces. Under the Ridwans, Gaza was a peaceful and prosperous place. It was the center of a large agricultural district that exported grain, cotton, and fruit all over the Mediterranean.
It is a stark contrast to the modern image of Gaza as this dense, urbanized strip. Back then, it was a sprawling green cosmopolitan hub. It was only with the arrival of the 20th century and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire that things started to tighten up. During World War I, Gaza was the site of three major battles between the British and the Ottomans. General Edmund Allenby eventually broke through the Ottoman lines there in 1917, which opened the way for the British to take Jerusalem.
That brings us back to the British Mandate and the drawing of those first administrative lines. It is worth considering how the transition from a global crossroads to a closed border happened. In the Ottoman era, there were no hard borders. You could travel from Gaza to Cairo or Gaza to Damascus without ever showing a passport. It was all one empire. The British were the ones who started introducing modern Western notions of fixed surveyed borders like that 1922 line.
That is the irony. The British were trying to bring order to the region by drawing these straight lines in the sand, but by creating these rigid boundaries in a place that had always been fluid, they set the stage for the conflicts that followed. When the 1948 war happened and those lines were redrawn by military force, the fluidity was gone. Gaza went from being a gateway to being a dead end. It was cut off from its hinterland in the Negev and its traditional markets in Egypt and the north.
The dead end of the Gaza Strip is a modern geopolitical creation. It is the result of what happens when you take a dynamic historical crossroads and try to freeze it into a static military shape. The shape itself is the problem. It was never designed to be a functioning economic or social unit. It was designed to be a place where two armies stop shooting.
We are still living with the consequences of that freezing. When you look at the challenges in 2026, whether it is governance, security, or the humanitarian situation, you are looking at the result of a 77-year-old temporary military accident. We actually touched on some of the modern governance models that have been proposed to deal with this in episode 862, where we discussed the Board of Peace and other ideas for how to manage these hardened security corridors. The problem is that the geography itself is working against normal development.
It makes me wonder if we will ever get back to a world where Gaza can be a crossroads again. But as long as the security reality is defined by those 1949 lines, it is hard to see how that happens. The Strip shape itself is almost a prison for the region's potential. It is too small to be a self-sustaining state, and too isolated to be the trade hub it once was. It is a 10 by 40 kilometer box created by a ceasefire.
That is the tragedy of it. The geography was engineered for a ceasefire, not for a society. When you build a border based on where the artillery stopped firing, you are not building for the long-term health of the people living on either side of that line. You are building for a tactical pause that never ended. And because it never ended, the temporary line became a permanent wall.
Looking at the takeaways here, the first big one for me is just recognizing how unnatural modern borders often are. We tend to look at maps and assume those lines have some deep, ancient meaning. But in the case of the Gaza Strip, the line is literally a snapshot of a battlefield from February 1949. It is a historical accident that became a geopolitical reality.
Right. If you want to understand the world, you have to look at the how and the when of the map making. The Gaza Strip is not a historical region. It is a cartographic byproduct of the 1949 armistice. The second takeaway is the importance of distinguishing between the city and the Strip. The city of Gaza has this multi-thousand-year heritage as a cultural and economic powerhouse, the Athens of Asia. The Strip is a 20th century political construct that has largely suppressed that historical role.
A third takeaway is the danger of the provisional. The 1949 armistice was meant to be a temporary stepping stone to a final peace treaty, but because that treaty never happened, the provisional became permanent. We see this all over the world, in Korea, in Cyprus, in the Balkans. Temporary lines have a way of becoming the most intractable problems because they were never designed to be permanent. They lack the logic of a real border.
It is a reminder that in geopolitics, there is nothing more permanent than a temporary measure. If you are interested in this kind of geographic engineering, I really recommend checking out episode 544, Engineering Sovereignty. We go into the nuts and bolts of how these kinds of puzzles get created in the first place, and why they are so hard to solve once the cement of history starts to dry.
Definitely. And if you have been following the more recent developments, episode 862 gives some good context on the governance models that are being debated right now in 2026. It is all connected. You cannot understand the current security challenges without understanding the accidental geography that created the playing field.
Well, Korn, I think we have covered a lot of ground today, from the ancient Athens of Asia to the modern military footprint. It really changes how you look at that satellite map, doesn't it? You see the lines, but now you see the ghosts of the people who drew them and the armies that held them.
It really does. Next time I see that protrusion in the Negev, I'm going to be thinking about Ralph Bunchy and Rhodes and the Egyptian tanks in the sand. It is a powerful reminder that history is often made in the moments when people are just trying to get through the day and stop the bleeding, rather than planning for the next century.
Well said. And hey, if you are enjoying these deep dives into the why behind the headlines, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or over on Spotify. It genuinely helps other curious people find the show and join the conversation. We are trying to build a community of people who look at the map and ask why.
It makes a big difference. And if you want to make sure you never miss an episode, you can find all the ways to subscribe at myweirdprompts.com. We have the RSS feed there, links to all the platforms, and even a contact form if you want to send us a prompt like Daniel did. We love digging into these technical, weird corners of history.
We are also on Telegram. Just search for My Weird Prompts, and you can get notified the second a new episode drops. It is the best way to stay in the loop and see the maps we are talking about.
Thanks for joining us today on this journey through the maps and the centuries. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Until next time, I am Herman Poppleberry.
And I am Corn. We will talk to you soon.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow to